I think most Buckeye fans want to get to Saturday. Most Buckeye media, players, coaches, everybody wants to get to Saturday and see how this goes. I think I'm one of the few people that have remained optimistic based on the people I talk to, the people on social media, on our message boards. Maybe the others are just less vocal, but I've seen this team and fan base have its struggles, but it's an angry group right now. And look, understandably, you lose for a fourth time to Michigan, especially that Michigan team. You and I talked about it before the game, and I don't think either of us expected that, right? So I get the frustration from Buckeye fans, but at the same time, like, team's in the playoff, and you still could win a national championship. So yes, I'm looking forward to Saturday. If for nothing else, then it's another game to talk about as opposed to going back through the Michigan debacle.
Yeah, a game against a pretty good football team in Tennessee. These are the 8 and 9 seeds, so it's expected to be a big matchup and probably the most evenly matched talent standpoint game of the weekend, even though the Buckeyes are a solid touchdown favorite. I know you guys got a chance to talk to various offensive and defensive players, as well as both coordinators. And of course, the defense can't necessarily be completely let off the hook based on a couple Michigan drives late, but basically did their jobs in that game. It's more of the offense that causes the concern going into this game. And anything Chip Kelly had to say that makes you feel one way or the other?
Not makes me feel one way or the other, because my feeling on the Michigan game, well, my feeling on this team is we saw 11 games of good, especially offensively. I think you saw 10-ish games of good defensively, and especially the second half of the season after the Oregon game, which is the one game I would say they weren't good defensively. And then you have this Michigan game. And like, is this an outlier for the offense with Ryan Day trying to, prove a point by wanting to run the ball, Ryan Day and Chip Kelly, I guess, wanting to run the ball and be tough and all of those things instead of just winning the game? Or, is this offensive line now without Seth McLaughlin, in addition to Josh Simmons, a real problem? And is that going to be the reason that Ohio State doesn't advance in the college football playoff? I'm on the side of, I think while the offensive line is a factor, I think there are ways you can scheme around that and things like that. So I think that it was more the fact that it's Michigan, and this is just somewhat of a mental block right now for Ohio State and Ryan Day in particular. But to go back to Chip Kelly, I think like most of the season, this was one of the better play callers in the country. And I think he did exactly what Ohio State fans expected. So, I think that was my kind of thought process, even going into the interview with Chip Kelly, which, by the way, it took 2.5 weeks before we talked to a guy who's paid quite a bit of money to not only coach this team, but also speak to the media when things go wrong. But I did think Chip Kelly took responsibility. I think it sounds like, talking to both him and Ryan Day now twice this week, that they have a much better game plan in mind. Now, if you'd asked me before the Michigan game, I would have thought they'd had a pretty good game plan for that one too. But, both guys, Ryan Day and Chip Kelly, took fault, admitted that things could have been done differently. I think they realize that they have a weakness on the interior of the offensive line. And while you can move people around and work with guys and try and strengthen that group, there's only so much you can do, especially as you're playing some of the best teams you're going to face all season, right? And so what else can you do to help this team move the ball down the field? I think that 2-minute drive or 2-minute drill drive right before halftime is a good example of things they can do, getting the ball out to these playmakers on the outside, using some more tempo. Ryan Day has been very hesitant this year. I know that they like what Will Howard can do in the huddle in terms of his leadership skills and talking to his teammates. And I think that's important. But at this point, I think you got to figure out the best way to win the game. And I think that may be, let's put a little bit more pace on it. You don't have to go Tennessee warp speed, but I think that catching Tennessee off guard with some of that, not allowing them to rotate guys in as much as they like to do, especially on what is a very good defensive line. All of that, at least in my mind, seems to be a recipe for Ohio State's offensive success. And while neither Ryan Day nor Chip Kelly were going to divulge what the game plan was, it does sound like they have learned from a game that they probably shouldn't have needed to learn from, but ultimately did.
Pat Murphy on the line, Bucknuts 247 Sports. Check out Pat's work leading up to the Tennessee game on Saturday night. The third guy that seems to be in the firing line after Day and Kelly would be Will Howard. And he's played a pretty good season. I don't know that anyone with a reasonable outlook on things would fault him for 90-some% of his play. Just the mistakes have been egregious. And obviously, when the offense did nothing, if the offense is putting up 30, 35 points against Michigan, then you throw 2 picks, and sure, you don't want to see that. But then they produce the rest of the game. But obviously, when in a tight struggle, defensive struggle, to get to 10 points, you turn the ball over twice in red zone or in complete minus territory backed up in your own end zone, then those cost you the ball game.
Absolutely. And look, this was kind of the Will Howard I was worried coming into the season that we'd see more of. You watch some of his games at Kansas State, and he was a little careless with the ball, be it interceptions or fumbles. And we didn't see Will Howard do that much this year. Against Oregon, he was very good. May have thrown an interception early, if you ask Oregon fans, but they didn't call it that. Penn State, he obviously had the interception, but responded really well to that. Indiana played very well. And so I want to say that this is out of character for the Ohio State version of Will Howard, even in big games. I don't know if that's going back to what I was saying about Ryan Day. And I think you might be able to say this about every player on the team, even some of the defensive players who played well. I just get the sense that there's so much buildup and so much talk about this game, and it gets in these players' heads that they just can't lose it, and they don't want to lose it for Ryan Day. And so they try and do things that maybe they wouldn't do normally. And that first interception, I think, is a good example of that. There's no reason for Will Howard to throw that ball. He's so often this year kind of lived to fight another day. And especially the placement of it. It either has to be right on Carnell Tate on the outside there. And by the way, strange play call coming out of your own end zone to throw an out route, across the field. But it just, again, it felt like he was trying to be, I've got to do something here. I've got to get us out of this situation, instead of, hey, let's just punt it, not give Michigan phenomenal field position. And we can come back. We're good enough to move this ball. So I think some of it's that. I think, and Ohio State and Will Howard in particular said after he took that hit and came out of the game, he was fine. He obviously, he had that 2-minute drive I mentioned earlier before half where he was really good. But outside of that 2-minute drive, it just didn't look like the Will Howard we'd seen most of the season. So I don't know if that jostled him, if that threw him off his game, if he was concussed for part of it, whatever the case may be. It didn't look like the normal Will Howard that Buckeye fans have gotten used to. And you are going to need that Will Howard in the playoff. Not only the ability to throw the ball, make plays with his legs, which I think you're going to need even more of in the playoff, but also his leadership. I wrote about this the other day. When we talked to Will Howard this week, he was testy, for lack of a better term, especially as he got more questions about the Michigan game, which I don't know if he expected. And I think that's a good thing. It was, again, out of character from what we've gotten from Will Howard all year. But if you use that as fuel, right? The anger at losing to Michigan and the frustration, and I've had to sit on this for 3 weeks, and then I come out ready to talk about Tennessee, and these dang reporters are just asking me Michigan questions. If that can be channeled the right way, I think it could be a positive, not only for Will Howard, but for the entire offense, because he is such a leader for this group. So we'll see on Saturday if he comes out looking like the quarterback I think he has been most of the year. But I think it's going to be a struggle, especially with some of the offensive line issues, if he's not, because running the ball and some of those other things they want to do, I think require Will Howard to be at his best. Running the ball specifically, I think they've got a pass to open the run because of the offensive line issues. So yeah, you're going to need your best version of Will Howard, not only this game, but going forward throughout, however many games, hopefully 4 for Buckeye fans they play in this playoff.
Will Howard, who said going into the Michigan game, coming into this game and having the rivalry all around him, had gained this appreciation and fully knew what it meant and so forth. Actually, it was probably that meeting with you and the rest of the reporters weeks later when he found out truly, no, this is what this rivalry means. It means it doesn't go away. It's not a big buildup to a big game like you're used to in other locations. No, it doesn't go away.
Well, and I think too, and he mentioned this the week leading up to the Michigan game. He was asked about, his record in rivalry games, and he goes, "Are you talking about Kansas?" It's like, we don't lose to Kansas. Like, that's not, this isn't the same thing. And so, like, I do think it may have caught him off guard, to some degree. Not only on I think it was Monday when we spoke with him, but just everything around that game. He probably has never had to do, even though Ohio State tries to limit the number of days that players are doing media leading up to that game. Like, he probably has never had to do that much, even before a Big 12 championship game. So, I do think it was probably a very different set of circumstances. And, this is what happens when you go from a place like Kansas State. No offense to that program, but from there to a place like Ohio State, not only do you have games like the Oregon game and things like that, where he's been in high stakes games like that before, but you also have this rivalry, and now you've got this playoff. And again, Will Howard's never done this, right? He's played in a Big 12 championship game. He's been on the road at Texas and led his team back to force overtime. But, now it's that win or go home type of mentality. The national championship is really on the line. What will we see from Will Howard?
Yeah, and just back to the play call that you referenced where he threw the interception out of his own end zone, what to me made that a bad play call, and with all the issues about the game plan, was that it's like 3rd and 9.
Yeah.
And the sticks are right there where the interception's thrown. And so if I'm playing defensive back for Michigan, and I know we have one of the best pass rushes and defensive lines in the nation, therefore they're not going to run like an out and up and try to burn me for 50 yards. This is where they're throwing the ball.
Yeah.
That's where it is right there. He's got to get it out of his hand, and it's going to go right there. And that's pretty much what it appeared to be.
Yeah, and I think, too, you watch that play back, like Carnell Tate by the time he turns his head, the interceptions happened and the defender's running away. Like, I know a lot of the blame went to Will Howard, but I'm not sure what Carnell Tate was doing there, if he didn't think the ball was going to come to him or not. I don't know. It was a weird play in general. And, I think if we're being critical of Will Howard in that game, we don't need to make Buckeye fans relive it too much, but it was a lot of throwing to that first read, whether it was open or not. Like, he tried to do it to Emeka Egbuka at least once, maybe 2 more times in that game, where if you look at the rest of the field, there's a guy open on, he just never gets there and tries to force it or misses on a throw to Egbuka. So, again, this is why I wonder, was it all right up there? Because he didn't do a lot of that this year. He's not a perfect quarterback, but he did make good decisions and didn't often put the ball in harm's way like that. And especially not a second time in a game. That was the first time he'd thrown 2 interceptions in a game all season for Ohio State. So, hopefully he doesn't get hit in the head again.
When you say that much of this had to do with what was going on between his ears, I would tend to say that could be said about 50 players. What was going on between their ears. It's funny when you hear the build up to these playoff games, 4 of them coming up this weekend. This is the one game. The other ones are football talk, X's and O's. Who's better? Who's got the better quarterback? Who's got the better defense? Et cetera, et cetera. This is the one that seems to center around Ohio State's psyche. And that seems to be the number one factor in this game.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's just because of how the Buckeyes come into this game. It'd be one thing if they'd gone into Indy, they'd beaten Michigan, gone to Indy, and lost to Oregon for a second time, like Penn State did. Similar fashion. I think then you don't worry about that, right? Like, maybe it's worse. The margin is worse than when you went out to Eugene, but ultimately you're still, you lost to the number one team in the country, and you probably have a better seed in that scenario because you look at where they placed Penn State. So yeah, I think that because you got upset in such a fashion to your rival, it's right to question that. And this is on Ohio State to go out and dispel that notion. Hey, we played a bad game. We lost to a team we shouldn't have lost to, and it happened to be in a rivalry game, and this, that, and the other thing. The thing I keep trying to remind people is like, this was the number 2 team in the country for the vast majority of the year, right? So, the AP poll, the coaches poll, and then the college football playoff group, that's 3 different sets of rankers. And, I know the coaches poll probably doesn't mean as much because they just kind of, have interns fill it out or whatever it may be. But like, still, most people in the country felt this was the number 2 team in the nation for the vast majority of the season. And there's every right to drop them if you lose to Michigan. But like, that talent didn't just disappear. The coaches didn't forget how to coach. I think there's something in their heads about that Michigan team right now, but Tennessee's not coming in wearing maize and blue, right? I mean, that Tennessee orange is not the maize color. So I think, and maybe I'll be very wrong on Saturday, but I think that you're going to get that number 2 team in the country who, obviously would much rather be sitting at home watching these games. But, if you're talking rankings, we're talking 6 and 7. Well, they beat 2 top 5 teams this year, right? Already. So like, I still see that pathway for Ohio State. And, I understand why Buckeye fans coming off that game are frustrated. And, I know plenty of them that have said, including one that lives in my home, that said, they don't even want to deal with the playoff now because of that loss to Michigan. Well, it was similar against Georgia, right? And then Ohio State goes out and puts on that performance against Georgia, doesn't win the game, but Buckeye fans certainly have a reason to be upset with some of the decisions in that game, specifically some of the officiating. And like, that completely changed the narrative. It was still crappy to lose to Michigan, but like, you were maybe a bad call and a missed field goal away from probably winning the national title. I think this team has the ability to do that, but, close the deal. Now you have to win 4 games instead of 2, and you have to play Tennessee and Oregon. But I definitely think that the talent is there. All those guys that came back are still there that got the team to this point.
Well, hopefully this much ballyhooed team meeting the day after the Michigan game purged them of a lot of this ill will and bad memories and so forth and so on. It's obviously not magic, but did anybody give any indication as to what was said in that meeting?
Yeah, I actually thought we got some, well, not, hey, here's what happened. Here's the minutes from the meeting. Will Howard was asked if things got heated, and he was like, no. And he's like, actually, yeah, like it did. But Caleb Downs was asked about it and, admitted that, they had to have some real conversations. And I said this on a show we did earlier today. I think it's good. Like, first of all, the way that it got presented on Twitter or, social media, message boards, whatever, I think it was like meant to be like there was some sort of mutiny. And I don't think it was that. Like, I think after every game, you meet, right? Whether it be your position group, your side of the ball, the whole team, whatever it is. And after losses, those meetings are less fun. And after you lose to your rival for the 4th time, sometimes guys have to stand up and say some things. And, whether it was the defensive guys talking to the offensive, whatever it may be, having real conversations after a loss like that, when you have something still very much to play for, maybe not exactly how you thought it was going to be, I think is essential. I think if Ohio State just kind of goes about its business, waiting to find out who they play in the college football playoff, and, you let maybe some resentment or just things go unsaid, maybe you do go out and lose in that first round, and maybe they still do. We don't know, but I think those things needed to be said. It sounds like they were productive conversations. One of the things that came up this week was not only coaches holding players accountable and players holding each other accountable, but players holding coaches accountable. And, I can imagine, this is just me speculating, but there were probably some things said to Chip Kelly, Ryan Day about what the hell was that, right? Like I said before, that wasn't us. What were we doing out there? And, I think that's good. And when the coaches were asked about some of that, they were also, I think it was acceptable. I don't think anything crossed a line or things like that. I think it's like I said, good conversation that after a loss like that. I mean, what was Ohio State? A 20-point favorite, 19.5-point favorite? Like, that doesn't happen in that rivalry, maybe ever. Now, if you want to go back to, Urban losing some of those games, the Iowa game, the Purdue game, I imagine there were some pretty heated conversations after those losses too. So, I think it's not something you want to do, but something you needed to do. And it sounds like everything was handled well, and now they can go and use that productively.
Pat, in terms of the nuts and bolts of the football on the field, is the Ohio State offensive line versus Tennessee's front the biggest concern in this game?
Yeah, I think so. I think I don't think it would really matter who you're facing right now if you're Ohio State, given, Indiana, the offensive line was good enough, obviously, but you still didn't run the ball probably as well as you wanted to. There were some bad snaps, and then that carried over, obviously, to what happened against Michigan. So I think no matter who Ohio State got in the playoff, that was going to be a topic of conversation going into the first game. Doing it against the Tennessee defensive line that is both really talented and really deep is concerning, I think, if you're the Buckeyes. Now, we saw about 10 minutes of practice the other day, and they really didn't do much. So it's hard to judge what exactly they're going to do. It sounds like they're going to rotate at guard a bit more with Tegra Shabola, Luke Montgomery, and Austin Saraveld. I'm not a fan of rotating offensive linemen during the game, but I'll trust these coaches to have evaluated and figured out the best way to do that if that does end up being the plan. I will say, as good as the entire Tennessee defensive line is, the strength's really on the edge, right? James Pierce Jr., the defensive end, who is going to be a problem even if you have really good tackles. This is a guy who I think is probably going to play on Sundays for a long time. Fortunately, Donovan Jackson now is several weeks into playing left tackle. I think he's played pretty well. He's already played a really good edge rusher against Penn State. I think Josh Fryer has played pretty well this season. The athleticism of Oregon's defensive line scares me a little bit against him, but they've had to deal with that this year. I think the fact that you've seen a defensive line like Michigan's and like Penn State's means you have film to say, okay, here's what we did well, here's what we didn't. Let's learn from that, both coaching and players on the field. But no doubt, I mean, if Ohio State's offensive line can't protect Will Howard, can't give these running backs at least some running lanes, if the coaches can't scheme up ways to do some things, because I think it was both. Like, the interior of Ohio State's offensive line against Michigan wasn't great. Obviously, the coaching, running up the middle, it was like banging your head against the wall. But I also think, like, there's some execution things too, if you go back and look at it, where, okay, maybe there was an opportunity to hit a hole here and you didn't, or maybe an offensive lineman, had the block and released too quick, things like that, that also prevented some more yards and potential bigger plays. So, I think it's good that this group has had, and by this group, I mean, the linemen, the running backs, Will Howard, the coaching staff, all that. They've had these 3 weeks. They had a week where they didn't even have an opponent really to plan for. They could focus on themselves, that even though they were already starting to look ahead to some potential matchups because they knew the likely teams they would play. And then you were able to kind of dive into Tennessee and kind of turn that up towards what you were doing before with this offensive line and that group towards Tennessee and apply it to this group that you're going to face. But yes, to answer your question, that was a long way of saying that is the matchup to watch. And, I think whoever wins in the trenches, and I know this is cliche to say, but I think especially in a game like this, is probably going to win the game.
Pat Murphy, Bucknuts, 247 Sports. Check out Pat's work. Get yourself ready for Ohio State and Tennessee. It should be, if nothing else, interesting for sure to
Yeah,
see how this one goes.
A night game at the Shoe.
A night game, not playing at noon. That's for Happy Valley and SMU.
Right.
All right. Pat, appreciate you stopping by. Enjoyed the game.
All right. Thanks, Mark.